Hey there. I guess we should get started. Let's do it. I know a lot of you are still coming in, so but we just wanted to thank everyone who's here today. We're very, very excited for the event we're going to have tonight. My name is Chris Jackson. I'm the publisher and editor-in-chief of One World Books, and I'm here with Elizabeth Mendez-Berry, our vice president and executive editor. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello, Chris.
Hi. Great to have you here. And as I said, great to have all of you here for this exciting Banned Book Week event, co-sponsored with our partners at the American Library Association. So Banned Books Week was launched in 1982 as a way of responding to that era's organized attempts to challenge and ban books in schools, bookstores, and libraries. The purpose of the week, which is now sponsored by a wide array of organizations, including the American Library Association, is to call attention to these attacks and to show support for our right to seek and to express ideas, even those considered unorthodox or unpopular. It's a week that's always been close to my heart as an editor and now publisher who's often tried to champion counter narratives to the dominant story of this country. And it's closer to my heart this year, perhaps, than most. So we brought together a great group of One World's writers for this event, many of whom have seen their own work under unusual, if not unprecedented, and sustained attack this year. When we sent out the call for authors to participate, I was really moved by how many of them were eager to get involved, which has led to something of an embarrassment of riches. So tonight, we're going to hear from Ta-Nehisi Coates, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Cathy Park Hong, Ibram Kendy, Heather McGhee, Rashad Robinson, Riva Lair, Adam Serwer, and Bryan Stevenson. But we'll also be sending you a bonus recording after the event with additional beautiful pieces from our writers, Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, Kali Fajardo Ernestine, and Picshuen Fung. So a total embarrassment of riches, but I think tonight's program is going to be really special. Elizabeth?
Thank you so much, Chris. Like Chris, I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. I started in publishing just about 1.5 years ago. And so the degree of attacks that our authors have experienced is something that was unexpected to me in some ways. Certainly the banning of books is something that's happened for many, many years. But our authors have also been under attack, not just in the library context, not just in the school context, but actually, from the highest halls of power. And so that's been devastating in many ways. And it also speaks to the power of their work. So I just wanted to lay out a little bit of context for this conversation for today before we jump into it. The first thing I wanted to talk about is something that I learned from a book, from a report by the Narrative Initiative that I found incredibly useful, and it's called Towards a New Gravity. And it talks about the idea of narratives as being sort of overarching constellations of stories that help us understand the world. And in this country, there's a very particular narrative, a heroic narrative, a glorious story of progress that has defined how many of us are. It's what we're taught when we're kids. It's what's reinforced throughout our lives. And it's a story that isn't necessarily true. And I think one of the things about the authors who you're going to hear from tonight is that they're people whose work complicates the narrative, whose work invites other voices in that have historically been excluded, and also offers a version of the American story that is not predicated on innocence. And I think that's one of the things that makes their work so fascinating. So one of the things that we also really wanted to mention is that on the one hand, there are all these authors, including One World authors and authors who are not One World authors, but who are doing really important and provocative and exciting and necessary work. And so we want to salute all of them, whether their work has been banned or challenged, or whether their work is simply pushing us, our collective imagination forward. And we also want to note that something that has happened in the past 1.5 years in the national conversation has really impacted the degree to which One World's books have been both received and popularized, and then also attacked. And that is the massive movement, multiracial, unprecedented movement that rose up in the aftermath of the protests after George Floyd was murdered by the police. And I think one of the things that happened after that was that many Americans started asking for new stories to explain the truth of what had happened, the injustice of what had happened. And authors like some of our One World authors were there offering a different perspective. And so tonight you will hear from our authors on the theme of what do you wish you'd learned in school but didn't? Of course, again, banning books is something that's happened for many, many years. And then there's also the longstanding practice of omitting entire histories and identities from school curricula around this country, as well as the fact that many books simply never get published. Our One World authors, many of them have actually dedicated their lives to writing the books that they were not able to read coming up. And so we're looking forward to hearing from them on this topic, and also to celebrating some of the people who are on the front lines of the narrative wars that are happening in this country right now, from educators to lawyers and everyone in between. Thank you, and back to you, Chris.
Thanks. So as Elizabeth mentioned, the prompt for our writers tonight was the question, what did you wish you'd learned in school but didn't? And we invite all of you to share in the chat things that you wish you'd learned in school but didn't, because I think all of us have those omissions and erasures in our own education. The reason for the question, as Elizabeth mentioned, is that what's now under attack are the kinds of ideas, histories, and information that many of us never had access to in our own educations. So this year we've lost two essential writers who were, for me, very important in unveiling hidden histories, and who both were essential in teaching me things that I wish I'd learned in school. One was James Lowen, who's the author of Lies My Teacher Told Me, among other works, which was very eye-opening to me as a young reader. And the other is Leon Litwack, who wrote a number of extraordinary histories, including Trouble in Mind, about life during Jim Crow America. And I grew up in Harlem back in the 1980s, and I'd heard messages my whole life about how Black people weren't interested in education, that Black people thought school was for white people, that Black people had no interest in academic pursuits, which made no sense to me because I was Black and I loved to read, and so did my family, and so did lots of kids I grew up around. So I didn't learn much about Jim Crow in school, and it wasn't until I was around college age that I encountered Litwack's book on the subject. The opening story in that book is about a sharecropper named Charlie Holcomb and his son, Willie. Charlie was a sharecropper as his father had been before him, but he wanted more for his son. So he saved up his money to send him to college, to the Agriculture and Technical College of North Carolina. Willie came back from college with the ability to read and to calculate. He discovered that his father was being ripped off by the white men at the warehouse where he sold his crop. Willie challenged those white men, and the next time Charlie saw his son, he'd been murdered. Charlie decided at that point that he would not send any of his other children to school. They would work on the farm, or at least they'd be safe. This story about hidden knowledge, about being punished for speaking the truth, about how Black people's curiosity, learning, and sense of justice was so brutally punished, explained so much to me about my own life, the life of my grandparents who had left the South, about why people who claimed Black people were inherently against education were lying, and why they were lying. It's a story that sticks with me today when people who try to widen their knowledge and then challenge power with what they learn are still treated with fear and are attacked and suppressed. And it reminds me that we cannot let the banners, the censors, the erasers win. And now we'll start our program with our first author, Ta-Nehisi Coates, author of Between the World and Me.
So this is, of course, a pretty interesting question for me to answer because I wasn't a great student in school. But I'll start small. I guess I wish, if I could think of one thing that I would change, I wish somebody had stressed the importance of learning a foreign language. What I did not realize at the time, of course, I took foreign language like everybody else did, in school. And my understanding of what a foreign language was that it was a matter of memorizing verb tenses, memorizing a list of nouns, and being able to repeat sentences. I didn't understand how that memorization translated into something larger in terms of the greater world. I didn't understand what that list of verbs and conjugations would give me access to. The learning was very, very abstract. I was a young kid growing up in West Baltimore, and if and I think I've said this before, I wish somebody had told me that the language wasn't merely a language. It was actually a door to a broader world. It was actually a way of comprehending more knowledge, a way of understanding more. And I think that actually gets to the heart, believe it or not, of what I think we're here to talk about this week, or what we're discussing this week. For so many of the authors who find themselves under the gun at this moment. And certainly, in conversations that I've had about works of mine that have been banned or, have been labeled inappropriate for kids a certain age, the notion has been that there are ideas within this work that we don't want our kids to learn, that we don't want our kids to be taught. And the notion behind that is that education is indoctrination, which I differentiate actually from education. Indoctrination is much closer to the way I was taught foreign language, that is to memorize a rote list of nouns or to memorize a list of conjugations without any real sense of what that knowledge is for, how to critically evaluate it, how to use it, how to be creative with it myself. And for me, I know since I've left school, the primary goal of education is not to be taught something as in to be able to regurgitate it back, but to be able to critique it, to be able to understand it, to be able to use it, to see things that I could not see before. That is to say, education at its best, all of our literature at its best, should not be ideas that are poured into the heads of children. Hopefully they're doors. Hopefully they open up space into a greater world in the same way that when I was in school, I wish that I had learned language, and language had been a door that I could have stepped through at that age to make my world bigger. I think this is so important because we're talking about, kids who, wherever they are, even in this age of the internet, are mostly confined to what they can see and the world around them in terms of their literal experience. And the process of getting access or gaining access to other worlds is so instrumental in leading a deep and fulfilling life. And so, I think it's really, really troubling to see this movement right now that seeks to constrict the education of children, that seeks to constrict their world, that seeks to constrict what they know. So
Thank you so much for that, Ta-Nehisi. Elizabeth?
Yeah, so I just wanted to quickly say something about Ta-Nehisi's work in this context because a teacher in Tennessee, a white teacher and baseball coach, recently lost his job as a result of teaching one of Ta-Nehisi's essays. And a little bit in line with what Ta-Nehisi just said, the teacher whose name is Matthew Hahn said, somebody asked him if Tennessee's anti-critical race theory bill makes him fearful about what you teach, it makes him fearful about what he teaches in the classroom. And the teacher responded, I don't know if fearful would be the right word. I just wonder what we are doing if we're not challenging our students, if we're not giving them these new ideas to discuss and debate.
That's really interesting. And apparently Matthew Hahn is with us right now. So Matthew, thank you for your work. So the next, excuse me, the next writer we're gonna hear from is Nicole Henna-Jones. Now, Nicole Henna-Jones is the Pulitzer Prize winning MacArthur Genius Grant receiving director of the 1619 Project at the New York Times, and which was one of the most acclaimed works of journalism, of our time when it was released in 2019. But it quickly turned into one of the most reviled and attacked works of journalism in our time. Why do you think that's the case, Elizabeth? What accounts for that transition?
Well, I think one of the things that people say, there's two kind of dichos about journalism. One is sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? The idea that opening up these stories and investigating these, histories is a necessary part of kind of healing and addressing old wounds and all that. And then the other is that journalism's got to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, right? And I think that Nicole's work is such a powerful example of that from my perspective. I've known her for, I think since she moved to New York in 2008 to work for ProPublica, seen the power for investigative reporting over the years and seen the scope of what she was interrogating expand in these very exciting and necessary ways until she was taking on that fundamental narrative of how we understand this story. And one of the story of this country, the history of this country. And one of the things I've thought a lot about in the past few years, and I've talked about with Adam Serwer, who we'll hear from a little bit later, is that, you know, journalists, Black reporters like Ida B. Wells were incredibly important in uncovering lynchings and racialized violence, but they didn't have the platform that Black reporters have today. Some Black reporters have today, and one of those reporters is Nicole Henna-Jones. And I think the idea that she has that platform and, you know, the skill set she has, the power she has, the insight that she has, and that she's asking these fundamental questions about the history of this country is almost terrifying to the people who are so invested in the notion of a very particular American narrative. That's, you know, and you know, the fact that there were lines around the block when the magazine came out, right? People are not lining up for newspapers these days, but they lined up for that particular volume of the New York Times Magazine. So I think it was that combination of the power of the questions that she's asking, and the fact that as a country, these are questions that are unresolved. You know, I don't know. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's right. So why don't we hand it over to Nicole Henna-Jones, author of the 1619 Project.
Hi, I'm Nicole Henna-Jones and the creator of the 1619 Project. I do not remember if there were certain books my schools were prohibited from teaching us when I was a child, but I do know that there were entire histories and peoples that were simply erased. I was taught about manifest destiny, but not Indian removal. I was taught about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and how they were planned, that they were men who made their living off of human bondage, and that their primary occupation was that of being a slave owner. I was taught about the Mayflower in 1620 and the freedom-seeking Puritans who immigrated, but not about the White Lion and the enslaved Africans forced here in 1619. I do know, though, that the absence of Black people, of Indigenous people, from our histories, from the English canon, from the artists we were introduced to, was not a neutral thing. That in the absence, we filled in the blanks with presumptions about who had a history worthy of learning, about who had written works worthy of reading, and who had created art worthy of knowing. And the absence of literature, history books, and English texts that reflected the multiracial nation in which we live, that recounted the simply accurate truths that we are a nation founded on the ideals of liberty and the practice of genocide and slavery, renders us incapable of understanding the world in which we live. And I would argue, by design, unable and unwilling to dismantle the legacies of this past. The banning of books or ideas or understandings, whether through policy or through intentional omission, is at its root about a fear of losing power and control. This is done under the belief that ideas are dangerous because reading certain works is what changes actions. Exposure to different ideas, to different ways of thinking, to a world outside of the one that we know, is what leads us to challenge convention and the status quo. It's what leads us to see our struggle in those of others and to believe in our own ability to alter our course and the course of our communities. To ban a book or the discussion of an idea means that you do not believe that you can make a better argument, that you do not believe that your ideas or your ways or your histories can withstand the scrutiny of the challenge. There is a reason why Black people were the only people in the history of this United States for whom it was illegal to learn to read and write. Why white Southerners barred abolitionist literature and slave narratives and other works that might allow enslaved people to learn about and imagine a world outside of the lash. It is hard to control a people who understand the world does not exist in the narrow way that they have been taught. There's a reason why repressive regimes go after the artists and the intellectuals and the writers first. When I see legislatures and school boards and powerful U.S. senators trying to prohibit the teaching of the 1619 Project and eliminate its being discussed in schools. Or when I see prisons barring people whose bodies they literally control 24 hours a day from reading Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy because they might start to get ideas about the unjust system that they are ensnared in. I know that these are the actions of immoral and fearful people, of people who fear the liberating balm of knowledge and who seek control and not freedom. No society can truly be free if it bans ideas. We must resist the tyranny. Do I find things distasteful? Do I find texts that I feel take from my own humanity? Of course I do. But do I believe that those texts should be banned? That we should be prohibited from seeing those ideas, from contemplating those ideas, and from being exposed to those ideas? Absolutely not. The restriction on the free exchange ideas stands in opposition to a free society. We cannot be free unless we are free to engage in the thinking of every person and of every type.
Thank you so much for that, Nicole. That was beautiful, and aptly put.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about what Nicole shared, in addition to the specific attacks on specific books, she also talks about bodies of work, ideas, experiences that never get addressed, and that's really the subject of Cathy Park Hong's book, and also her presentation here. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit as her editor about how her book, Minor Feelings, was received and re-received, particularly in a moment of crisis, and what that says about what books can do.
Yeah, I mean, Minor Feelings is a great book. The subtitle is, An Asian American Reckoning, and it's a book that I think was valued by a lot of readers initially because it was, I think, one of the first times that a lot of readers saw themselves. I mean, readers of all kinds saw themselves in it, but I think particularly Asian American readers who saw her kind of grappling with some issues that they had not seen addressed in the sort of way that she was going at it, which was a way that was, full of, kind of uncertainties and her own kind of very subjective ways of experiencing it, which I think is part of what gave it power. I think what we saw earlier this year with some attacks on Asian Americans, and really going back to last year with the onset of COVID, provided, I think, another opportunity for readers to discover Cathy and to kind of just underline the value of seeing your life represented in books. And I think this is a theme that a lot of our writers will come back to again and again, which is, if you don't see that, not only is your imagination of what your life can be sort of restricted, but there is also an absence of catharsis and of understanding in the moments when you need it the most, which is one of the values of Cathy's book, certainly. So let's take a listen to what Cathy had to say about what she wished she learned in school but didn't. This is Cathy Park Hong, author of the Pulitzer Prize finalist, Minor Feelings.
When I was in high school, in all of my English classes, I don't recall reading a single novel or short story or even a poem by an Asian American author. Because of this, it took me a long time to realize I had permission to be a writer, because for so long, I didn't think I had a place in American literature because I had no role models. In my history classes too, I learned very little, if anything, about Asians in America. I certainly don't recall learning about the Chinese Exclusion Act, the fact that the Transcontinental Railroad was built by Chinese immigrants. The Japanese internment camp, too, was a footnote to the many books I've read concerning World War II. I am Korean American, second generation, and I had family members who died in the Korean War. I had family members, who were separated from each other when the country was divided in two. The Korean War was taught to me, but again, it was told from the perspective of the architects of the Cold War. It was simply a global containment policy. Or I learned that the war was a necessity for freedom, for democracy, and that the Americans managed to save South Koreans and turn the country into a democratic nation. I did not know until many years later that 5 million Koreans died in the war. Every time I learned about Asians in America or American wars abroad, I was always deeply saddened by how late in age I discovered it. It wasn't easily available to me, not even in college, not even afterwards, in films or TV. I think about all the Vietnam movies I grew up on, that I watched avidly, all those movies that won Oscars, or the action movies starring, I don't know, someone like Sylvester Stallone. And out of all of those movies, there was not a single movie from the perspective of a Vietnamese citizen or a Vietnamese American. They were always extras who were being shot down. In my book, Minor Feelings, I write that to lead an ethical life is to be held accountable to history. This applies not only to white people, but Asian Americans, Latinos, and Black people. This applies to men and women, straight people, and the LGBTQ community. This applies to Americans and all of the countries around the globe. If the US is truly a democracy, we don't sanitize our history. Nations under authoritarian governance sanitize their history. Americans prove our moral standing by being held accountable, by being honest, by not feeding our student myths or one side to our history, but the unvarnished truths, now that's plural, truths of how it came to be the most powerful nation in the world.
Thank you so much for that, Cathy.
Yeah, thank you to Cathy for that. I love that idea of being accountable to history, and I love the idea that we don't sanitize the story. So now we're going to move on to Dr. Ibram Kendy, and I wanted to ask you a question because Dr. Kendy is one of the people among our authors who have been targeted most viciously in many different ways. He's been named in legislation. He's been trolled. He's had a range of very extremely vicious experiences around his work. And so I was curious if you as his editor could talk about, your perspective on what's been happening and what it means for his work and what it means for the world. I think at the same time, his work has been incredibly well received by so many too. So it's a both and, but I'm curious about what you think.
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. It's a both and. I think he certainly has been very gratified and by the reception of the work, as have we, that so many people have found in it. Like, it's not just a book that's about history and ideas and about, Ibram's own experience, but it's a book that can help, I think, readers to think more deeply about how to build an anti-racist society, which to me is, of course, one of the most important things that we should all be concerned with. It's kind of ironic that it was a book about anti-racism that has riled people up so much about Dr. Kendi. It's very sad. He just won a MacArthur, quote unquote, genius grant this week, which was an amazing honor for him. The article about it in the New York Times opened with him saying that he can't even answer his phone anymore because he doesn't know what violent, hostile people will be on the other end. And meanwhile, states around the country have been attacking him by name and trying to stop his work. The beautiful part, of course, is that his work has only grown in its reach, and I think the power of it is really evidenced by the irrepressibility of the ideas. So I'm really thrilled to turn it over now to Dr. Ibram X. Kendy, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist and Stamped from the Beginning. Dr. Kendy.
There's so many different things I wish I would have been taught in high school, but I think at the top of the list, I think I wish I would have learned about the historic criminalization of Blackness and Black people. And I think the reason why I would have wanted to learn about this in high school is because I went to high school in the 1990s. And if there was ever a decade in American history where Black youth were demonized and criminalized and considered the American problem, it was the 1990s. Of course, that was the decade of the super predators. That was the decade in which we had this massive mass incarceration of Black people, largely young Black and brown youth. This was the decade in which I was constantly told that I was dangerous and people like me were dangerous. And some of those ideas I ended up internalizing, or I was deeply confused, about what I was hearing and witnessing and seeing and experiencing, and certainly all of the ways in which I was being racially profiled by police and other state actors, as a Black youngster. I just didn't really know what was going on. I knew or suspected there was a problem. I knew and suspected that the way I was being treated and other people like me was problematic, but I didn't know precisely the history of this. I didn't know why it was happening. I didn't know that it had happened over the course of history. I didn't know why it was intensifying in the 90s. There was just so many questions that I had that I didn't know that I had, that I wish would have been answered for me, as a Black youngster, growing up in the 1980s and 1990s. And I think that's why I'm personally so committed to trying to answer those questions for young Black and non-Black youth today.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Kendy. And I think for me, there's an interesting kind of transition here between Dr. Kendy and Riva Lair, who's our next speaker, in the sense that he's talking about a certain type of visibility and perception and image that he was contending with as a young person. And as you'll hear, she's talking about type of invisibility that she experienced as a young person in a world of images, none of which included her and included people like her. So that's one thought on Riva. Did you want to add anything, Chris?
Well, just that, Riva is a remarkable artist whose education began in the early 1960s, which is, of course, a particularly challenging time to be a disabled queer artist trying to find herself, but not finding any models, as you said, anywhere in the world. And I think you make a really good point about the kind of contrast between the sort of hyper visibility in a certain respect and invisibility, which I think connects a lot of our writers tonight. Maybe we should just go right into it and hear Riva Lair, author of Golem Girl, which I highly recommend to everyone.
Hi, I'm Riva Lair. I'm author of Golem Girl, a memoir. And I've been asked to talk about what I wish they'd told me in school. That's a lot of stuff. I grew up disabled. I was born at the end of the 50s. And there's this line from a parody movie about superheroes called The Specials. And the line is, how do you know you're special? You went to a special school, which I did. It was a school for people with disabilities, kids with, it was originally called the Cincinnati School for Crippled Children. And it was considered to be very progressive because they gave us what they called a standard education, which meant that we weren't being trained to work in a sweatshop, which is mostly what disabled people got by way of education. So we got history and geography and English and math and all that good stuff. What we didn't get was any idea of what we could be in the world. We got no encouragement to dream, to think about wanting to be an engineer or a doctor or a botanist or all the things that would have been open to people back then at a normal school. People being asked, children being asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And no one ever asked us at all, because the idea was that society had no place for us, that jobs were under no obligation to hire us. Universities, high schools were under no obligation to take us in, much less universities. Very few people like me went to universities. Mostly we ended up in institutions. I was lucky. I did get to go to college. I went to art school. And when I went to art school, the next thing they didn't tell me was, what they didn't show me were any pictures whatsoever of people with physical impairments or variations, just variations. I fell in love with portraiture, and portraiture was about power and beauty, and often those two things being the same. So I am sure I saw thousands and thousands of figure paintings when I was in school, including when I went to the School of the Art Institute. And I can scarcely recall one image that was of anyone who was body variant. So I started to make pictures. I started to work with people who were like me, who had different bodies and who were also living in a world without mirrors that we wanted to look into. So this is what a few of them look like. I'm going to show you. Possibly. That's my book. So I do portraits of people who have careers in the arts, academia, and their work deals with the fact that they are body variant, or they explore disability aesthetics or studies for their own sake. Here are just a few portraits. So painting. I also am queer. And I also, when I went to art school, I didn't see any, probably a few images of people who were explicitly LGBTQ plus, etc. This is Allison Bechdel. This is a self-portrait because I wanted to understand my own body. None of the education I got included anything, no role models. God forbid I'd even be told about Helen Keller, who is very controversial in disability culture, but not even that. I didn't know we'd had a president who used a wheelchair. And the other thing I never got was when I went to hospitals and saw my doctors, they didn't teach me anything about how to be who I was. They taught me how to deal with immediate medical issues, but they were the people who were most likely to see a lot of disabled people every day, all day. They could have shared their knowledge. They could have told me about people who were living successfully. Instead, I, like most of the people that I knew from my generation and the previous generation, and to some extent, every generation since, we have had to invent how to be in the world. We've had to invent a culture. We've had to make pictures and show them to each other, to dance for each other, to write for each other, to make movies for each other. And of course, we engage with the mainstream. But the most important thing is that we all grew up in places and times and institutions that didn't think that our stories meant anything at all. So happily, I am with One World. They believed in my story and the stories I tell of those I work with. And I just want to say thank you. Be well.
That was really beautiful. You know, it's interesting because she talks about the lack of representation of both body variant people, but also of queer people when she was coming up. But those LGBTQ authors and subjects have been the primary targets of so many banned books over the years.
Yeah, I think it's so important to talk about how the current attacks rest on infrastructure that was built over many years of attacks, particularly on LGBTQ books. And I think one of the so many things that Riva said resonated so much, but the idea of learning how to be who I was and having to invent how to be in the world, I feel as if so many of the efforts to undermine stories about LGBTQI plus people have been specifically to undermine their ability to feel at home in the world. And the idea that that's kind of the foundation upon which the attacks that many of the attacks that we're facing is resting is really devastating and also not that surprising. You're muted, Chris.
Sorry, I feel like I'm at work now. Where I'm always muted. So one of the things that that comes up a lot in the attacks on banned books, particularly, you know, moving back to the ones that are sort of address anti-racist themes, is that they are the real racist. In fact, it's the anti-racist books that are divisive and that are separating people and that are causing racial division. But the truth is actually the inverse, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, gosh, there's so much on this. There's so much data around, even you can look at the stories from ethnic studies, right? And the fact that when young people have the opportunity to learn about their own cultures or other communities, the quality of their educational experience improves and also their relationships improve. So there's that. And then I think one thing that I learned in the course of several conversations with teachers, with the who have been doing work on the front lines of this specific issue right now, is that it turns out that right now, many of the teachers who are being scrutinized for teaching anti-racist content or, you know, a whole history of this country are white. And among the teachers who have been fired, you know, several are white. And the notion that that white teachers and white communities are interested in these stories and are interested in learning a more complete picture of American history is one that it appears that some people are incredibly uncomfortable with and are doing everything that they can to suppress it. And a second piece of that, which I think Heather McGhee explores in a really interesting way in her video, is the fact that when you teach a more complete history, it's not just about trauma. It's not just about awful things that happened in the past. It actually includes moments of solidarity and community across difference. And those stories in particular, some people really, really want to suppress. Here's Heather McGhee.
I'm Heather McGhee, the author of The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. One thing I wish I'd learned in high school is the lesson of Bacon's Rebellion, what some historians call the First Revolution. I didn't learn about it in school. I only learned about it when I was teaching myself labor history in my late 20s. And then I got to write a chapter about it in the book 400 Souls, A Community History of African America. Now, Bacon's Rebellion was a cross-racial servant uprising of African enslaved people and European indentured servants, and it succeeded in nearly overthrowing the slave colony of Virginia in 1676. The rebel army burned the capital of Jamestown to the ground. But the real lesson of Bacon's Rebellion, it's what happened after. Once the rebellion was crushed, the colonial plantation elite decided they needed to drive a permanent wedge between white and black workers to keep them from ever joining forces against them again. The post-Bacon laws, in large part, created the system of racial hierarchy that we take for granted as part of our history. They were a not very subtle at all bargain that wealthy white people offered their indentured servants and other poor and landless whites. Defend us and our exploitative system of racial slavery, and we'll make sure that you are treated slightly better than the Africans. Now, you won't have what we have, but at least you'll have plenty more than they do. The laws passed after Bacon's Rebellion made sure that white-skinned European people would be able to own property, not be treated as property. The plantation class enlisted all white men into a militia and gave them guns, while forbidding black people from owning weapons or even gathering in groups. This new racial bargain created skin color privileges that common white folk would die to defend. Now, if I'd known this history, I think it would have been easier for me to spot the plantation class strategy in my own time, where the wealthy rig up an unfair system, hoard the spoils of everybody's labor, and then get the people who aspire to be them, but who, because of the unfairness of the system, never will be, to defend that very unfair system. Of course, today the defense of the system happens with ballots, not with bullets. It's why white Americans are the largest share of the poor and the uninsured, and yet the majority of white folks vote to suppress the minimum wage, to keep it low, to cut food stamps and health care. Now, if I'd known this history, I would have known something that wasn't totally clear to me until I heard it from a white minimum wage worker in Kansas City, whom I interviewed for The Sum of Us. Bridget. She was organizing in the Fight for 15 in Kansas City, and she told me kind of the whole point of this movement is for white workers to understand that racism affects white workers too, because it keeps us divided from our black and brown brothers and sisters. So we need to understand that as white workers, we too need to stand up and fight against racism. Because as long as we're divided, she told me, we're conquered.
Thank you so much for that, Heather. Sorry for the delay between the end of one speaker and us returning. That's just the way it is. Next we're gonna talk a little bit more about, we've been talking thus far a lot about what's been missing from the history and the way that history has been taught. But now we're gonna talk a little bit about how that history is taught and kind of what's been missing in the method and the interpretive sort of application of the history that we've learned. Why would you say those two things are so important? Not just the what, but the how we're taught.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the devil's in the details, right? And as editors, we think about this stuff all the time. There's a tendency to sanitize the civil rights movement, right? To sanitize many of these important transformational moments in American history into one individual, a hero acting alone. You know, it has kind of almost like a an action movie kind of vibe to it. And, the story of Rosa Parks, the story of Martin Luther King, of course, come up again and again and again. And yet the way that they tend to be told is in such a way that they are sort of divorced from their surroundings and the movements that made them possible, that they were a part of. And what we wind up having is sort of one exceptional individual versus a leaderful community of people taking action together, like the group of people on this call tonight, which is full, I'm sure, of people who are taking action on these issues, may not be, on TV about it, but are trying to do their part. And I think that one of the challenges of the way that these stories get told is that they don't mobilize people to see a way into their own power.
Great. So we're going to listen now to Rashad Robinson, who's going to the director of what is his actual title? He's the president of Color of Change, I believe, and also a future One World author who's going to talk a little bit about how we learn our history.
Hello, I'm Rashad Robinson, and I'm the president of Color of Change. As an activist, I wish I had been taught honest histories about how social movements are grown and have become successful in our country. The story of Rosa Parks sparking a movement when she simply decided that she was too tired to get up for a white man on a bus erases decades of organizing and struggle that it took to reach that moment. The story of Martin Luther King Jr. giving his "I Have a Dream" speech as the lone example for a vision for the civil rights movement erases the dozens of other speakers and leaders that spoke alongside him during the March on Washington, and the thousands upon thousands of women and men, community organizers and activists all around the country that were working towards social change at the local and the national level. Change never comes from one person standing alone.
Thanks so much to Rashad for that statement. I know Color of Change is actually one of the organizations who's taken the lead on combating some of these efforts at banning.
Yes, absolutely. And so now, at this point in our show, I wanted to ask you, Mr. Jackson, if there were any books that were banned when you were in school, or if there's anything that you wish you had learned in school.
Yeah, so when I was in school, there was nothing that I was certainly aware of that was banned, but isn't that how it works? Is you don't know it's banned because you don't see it because you're a kid. But there were definitely, as I said, large omissions in my education, broadly, broad areas of history that I didn't learn, broad areas of every discipline that were sort of excluded from my education. And I had what I would consider to be a good education. But what's interesting is that there are still schools that take a different route. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that from our good friend, Adam Serwer, author of the best-selling Cruelty is the Point.
Thank you.
So I know the theme for this is, what I wish I had learned in school, but actually I had a very different experience where I'm extremely grateful for what I learned in school. And I think I had an unusual education in some ways. I went to a DC public school known as the Duke Ellington School of the Arts, and my teachers there were incredible. I had to read about Marcus Garvey, W.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington. I had to read books by Nella Larson, Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison, Ralph Ellison. When we did a Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry, I had to learn about the history of racist restrictive covenants in neighborhoods, that is, covenants that were attempts to keep Black people from moving into white neighborhoods, and how Lorraine Hansberry's own family had been barred from buying a home in Chicago that went all the way, in a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. I want to emphasize, though, that I also had to learn the classics. I had to read Aristotle, I had to read Aeschylus, I had to read Euripides, I still had to read Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry James. We did all those things, too. We just also learned about Black history and Black literature. And the irony is that, when I went from DC public school to Vassar, which is a private college, I had a much broader experience with American letters than kids, some kids whose parents had paid through the nose to send them to expensive private schools. So recently you have these conservative politicians in certain states trying to ban or censor certain books or ideas, particularly related to racial discrimination, from authors like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Bryan Stevenson, Ibram Kendy. And what this campaign of censorship is really about is about preventing kids from learning about that wider world. It is about maintaining an understanding of American history and literature that is really restricted, so that children do not question the social and economic hierarchies that they witness in their daily lives, so that they can continue to think about these hierarchies as natural and unchanging, not something that they could alter through participation in politics or public life. So it's not about protecting education at all. It's actually the reverse. It's about preventing kids from learning too much, and that's really a tragedy.
Thank you so much, Adam, for bringing the positive story of what schooling can look like and the experience it can be, and also that this principle that the suppression of these texts is really not about helping kids learn; it's about preventing them from learning too much. Speaking of preventing people from learning too much, I was wondering, Chris, if you could talk a little bit about the way that Bryan Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, which you edited, has been banned from so many correctional facilities, what that's about, what it tells us. I think the conversation around the banning of books, oftentimes we're not as aware of what happens within the correctional system, but the principle of it seems to me to be particularly nefarious.
Right. So Bryan's someone I've been working with for a long time. And when I first met him, I remember he was going through an issue with book bannings in prisons. This is even before his own book had come out. But one of the things that Bryan does, and if you know anything about Bryan, if you read Just Mercy or seen the movie, you know that he works with prisoners, and oftentimes prisoners who are on death row. But when they're not on death row, even prisoners who are might have like a young person who's been sentenced to life without parole. That's been a big part of his work as well. And one of the things he would do with his young clients is he would send them books, because he wanted them to continue their educations and to learn about the world and their circumstances, with the hope that he would eventually find a way to get them released. But even if he didn't, that they would nevertheless find ways to kind of expand their horizons within the prison. And I remember he was attempting to send one book called Slavery, a book by Douglas Blackman, called Worse Than Slavery, perhaps was the name of it. But it was about the ways that slaves were basically re-enslaved through slavery by another name. Thank you, Deborah, in the audience. People, what happened after in the sort of post-Reconstruction United States, where people were impressed into labor, people who had been in prison, usually on very trumped up charges, were then put into labor for what turned out to be very large corporations, including U.S. Steel and others. So Bryan would try to send that book to people he was working with, and the prisons refused to let it happen, because they were worried that when the prisoners got their hands on books like this, they would be less compliant. And I think it's fascinating, because we're seeing, as we have in many ways, how our system of incarceration, the logic of it eventually extends beyond the incarcerated into the world, the rest of us, so to speak. And sure enough, that's exactly what we're seeing today. But I will say no more, because I think it would be wonderful to listen to what Mr. Stevenson, our nation's genius saint, and one of the leading advocates in the country, and the author of the best-selling Just Mercy.
What do I wish I knew in high school? I didn't appreciate when I was in high school the way in which narrative shaped societies. I don't think I understood how fear and anger can create unfairness and injustice. I came of age at a time when we were pushing forward to dismantle decades of segregation and racial apartheid. I started my education in a colored school. In the community where I grew up, Black children weren't allowed to attend the public schools. We would drive past the Milton Public School every day to a small building, a colored school. There were no high schools for Black kids in my community when my dad was a teenager. He couldn't go to high school in our community. And even though he was hardworking and smart, the inability to have that option had a real impact. And I didn't understand how much of that had been created by decades of fear and anger and narratives about people. I was convinced that if we just worked hard and did our best, things would get better, and things did get better, but there were these larger issues that I didn't really understand. I was a product of Brown versus Board of Education. Lawyers came into our community, made them open up the public schools, and it was that intervention that changed things. I knew that if we had a vote in my community, the community was 80% white, the majority of people would vote to keep the schools segregated. But these lawyers were able to compel these institutions to open up schools to people like me. And because of what those lawyers did, I got to go to high school, I got to go to college, I got to go to law school. I wanted to be a lawyer because I believe that with rights, people who are disfavored, people who are marginalized, people who are excluded, people who are poor could still have opportunities like I had opportunities. What I didn't understand in high school is that moment that I grew up in, the 1960s, post Brown versus Board of Education, was a moment that before that, our courts had actually been institutions that denied opportunities. They had tolerated decades of racial violence and lynchings and terror. Our institutions didn't respond when Black people were pulled out of their homes and beaten and drowned and tortured. I didn't fully appreciate the way in which the legacy of slavery had been embraced and codified and endorsed by these same legal institutions that I was now desperately trying to become a part of. And that understanding has shaped the work that I do now. If I could talk to my high school self, I would still say, you should be a lawyer. You should learn to use the law to protect people who are disfavored, to protect the condemned, to protect children facing excessive punishment, to fight against this carceral state that's emerging, that has led our country to have the highest rate of incarceration. I would still tell my high school self that that's an important thing to do. I would tell my high school self that you haven't met a lawyer before, but you can be one. But I would also explain to my high school self that it won't be enough, that you're going to have to find ways to challenge these narratives that are all around us. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world because we've had too many politicians preaching fear and anger. They've taught us to be afraid and to be angry. We've declared this misguided war on drugs. We said that people who are drug addicted and drug dependent are criminals. We've created this false idea that we can put crimes in jails and prisons, and we've created sentences and punishments as if we can put crimes in jails and prisons. And what I would remind my high school self, what I would tell my high school self, is that you can't put a crime in jail or prison. You put people in jails and prisons, and people are not crimes. And that means we have to think a little differently about these things. I would tell my high school self that we've got to do a lot of work in this country to recover from generations, from centuries of enslavement. It's created a kind of toxin in the air that we continue to breathe in. And it doesn't matter how hard you work, it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how kind you are. You're going to face presumptions of dangerousness and guilt because of your color. And to overcome that, we're going to have to commit to truth-telling. We're going to have to commit to an era of justice. And that's why books and information are so critical to the health of any society. Societies fail, democracies fail, communities fail when they allow ignorance to reign. And a society that bans books is a society that is cultivating a kind of ignorance. I think about what would have happened without the writings of Phyllis Wheatley and Frederick Douglass, of abolitionists, of William Wilberforce, that helped us begin to understand the cruelty, the wrongfulness of kidnapping and abducting people and enslaving them, enslaving their children. I think about the importance of those ideas. I think about the writings of Susan B. Anthony, of Ida B. Wells, of women who began to push against this idea that women weren't capable of exercising the right to vote, having full engagement in society. Where would we be without breaking down that ignorance that shaped the role of gender? I think about the writings of Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel that helped us understand the cruelty, the barbarism of a Holocaust where millions of people were caught up and killed and the ignorance that surrounded that. I think about the writings today that are helping us to understand that we are living in a nation where indigenous people were subjected to a genocide, where there are places in the world, people of different faiths that are being oppressed and mistreated and abused from all corners of the planet. And that ignorance is something that we have to overcome. There is a great opportunity that books create to understand things that we don't understand, and that's the exciting thing about being an author, being a part of this community, but it's also the daunting thing that we're facing now, to imagine that books could be banned, that ideas could be excluded, that things can be manipulated in a way where we remain ignorant. I was fortunate as a high school student to be able to read the books that I wanted to read. To not be in a space where there were a lot of barriers. I want that for high school students today. I want that for all children today. To live in a society where ideas are never banned, where opportunity to overcome ignorance is never restricted. That's my hope. That's my dream.
Thank you so much for that, Bryan. Always such a pleasure to hear from him. So we've shared the perspectives of a number of our authors here tonight. And now to close out the program, we wanted to share some information from some organizations that are fighting for freedom of information and ideas. We're going to listen to Janai Nelson, who's the Director-Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, or the LDF. But I also want to just mention that we want to thank everyone for their donations, which was part of the program tonight, to the LDF. The LDF, Penguin Random House has matched all of those donations tonight, so that's thousands of dollars going to the LDF that does so much essential work. Their work against censorship is only one part of their broad portfolio. So let's take a quick listen to Janai.
I'm Janai Nelson, Associate Director-Counsel of the Legal Defense Fund, the nation's first and foremost civil rights law organization. As I listened to the accounts of some of the greatest writers and public thinkers of our time and what they wish they'd learned in school and what this crisis of truth-telling in our country means to them, I'm reminded of James Baldwin's powerful counsel that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. We're at a crossroads. We're at a crossroads in our history where there is a hunger for truth, for learning, for exchange, for challenge, for transformation. And that hunger is being met by alarming and concerted mobilization to suppress the truth of our collective history, of our lived realities. And make no mistake, the banning of books and the shutting of doors to other avenues of information are a battle to control memory, and ultimately a battle of narrative power, of how we and future generations will see ourselves and understand and make sense of our present and our past. In this year alone, 28 states have introduced legislation that erases the truth of what students in the United States can learn and the content that they can access about our history. In 14 states, various versions of these laws have passed. Some forbid specific materials like the 1619 Project or books from many of the authors that are featured here. Other laws forbid materials that make people feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or psychological distress. And all legislate ignorance. All are anathema to the principles of truth and learning and freedom of thought and speech and will that are the core of our American aspiration. I'm sitting here at the desk of Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American Supreme Court Justice and the founder of the Legal Defense Fund. He worked with a band of luminary lawyers like Charles Hamilton Houston, Constance Baker Motley, Jack Greenberg, and countless others to tell the stories of the most sordid chapters in our history in order to use the law to transform our society, to transform it to one that more closely resembles our constitutional ideals. In our landmark case from 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, we told the story of the devastating impact of subjugation of Black persons in this country and the psychological harm that segregation caused Black and white children, something I wish I'd learned in school. And there's no way that we would be where we are today if we did not teach and tell those stories, even though they undoubtedly produced feelings of discomfort and distress. Today's fight for truth is part of that ongoing battle for justice. Without truth, there's no basis for our demands for justice. And that's why we must fight fiercely to preserve truth, to preserve history in our public schools and libraries, to expand our knowledge of history and fact so that another generation does not grow up lamenting what they did not learn in school, what they did not learn about who they are, about who we are, and all the possibilities of what we can become. So I invite you to join the fight to protect truth. And there are 3 ways you can do it. First, you can engage your local school board and your local library board. Find out whether they are promoting inclusive, culturally responsive learning, or whether they are attempting to ban or remove books or take other measures to deny access to diverse ideas and perspectives. Second, contact your state representative. Make it known that you want inclusive and culturally responsive education in your state, and that you will hold accountable any elected official who supports efforts against truth with your vote in the next election. Finally, continue to educate yourself about the laws in your state that may restrict learning. You can go to our site, naacpldf.org/truth for more information. We at the Legal Defense Fund and many of our allies are working on challenges to these laws in state and federal courts. And of course, we could use your support too. But however you choose to engage, I want to thank you in advance for standing up for truth, history, critical thinking, diversity, equity, inclusion, and freedom of thought. James Baldwin also said that American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. We deserve to know that history in all its complexity through books and other sources of knowledge so that we can continue to chart a better future for us all. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Janai. That was amazing. We wanted to just offer a few more resources to the group because if you're like me, you're hot and bothered about this issue and you want to take action. And so if that's the case, obviously our wonderful partners at the LDF are doing really, really important work. And there's also lots of other organizations that are doing important work in this moment. And so we just wanted to highlight a few of them and also to encourage you to drop into the chat other names of organizations that are doing important work. One of the things that we've learned in the course of familiarizing ourselves with these issues is that the fight is local. It's at your school board meeting. It's at your school. Many, many teachers are being challenged. And so if you're a parent or if you're a part of a community, it really, really is worth writing a letter, showing up at the meeting if you can. And so we wanted to offer a few great resources. First of all, we also want to salute all of the other authors, One World authors, non-One World authors who have been producing provocative, powerful work and who are part of the Banned Books Week celebration. There's the Banned Books Week Coalition, which is has Jason Reynolds as the honorary chair. PEN America is doing fantastic programming this week as well. Please take a look at what they're up to. We wanted to mention the African American Policy Forum. Through their Truth Be Told campaign, they've become an organizing hub for people who are working to address the effort to turn back the clock on racial justice education in the United States. Our partners in this event, the American Library Association and the Freedom to Read Foundation, are doing fantastic work supporting librarians on the front lines all over the country, and supporting, working, advocating and educating in defense of intellectual freedom. They do really, really important work, and we're so delighted to be able to partner with them here tonight. Color of Change also is doing work as well, organizing a grassroots base to participate in the ongoing discussions of what should and shouldn't be taught in schools, promoting the universal value of learning about race and racism, and shifting the story to focus on what we all lose if Black history is not taught in our schools, and developing new narratives to move from defense to offense in this fight. Also wanted to give a shout out to Race Forward, which has been engaging their national network of 300 plus city and county governments to address the critical race theory issues when they come up. They have some resources on their website that you are welcome to check out. Also want to mention the Zinn Education Project, which has been mobilizing teachers around the country, incredibly powerful testimonials from teachers who are committing to teaching the truth. And their work is just so spectacular. So we wanted to mention these organizations for all of the work that they're doing, the courage that they're doing it with, and to encourage all of you to engage in whatever way you can. And I think just overall, before I jump off and pass it to my esteemed colleague, Chris Jackson, I just wanted to say that I think from the perspective of One World, we are dreaming of books as a door, into a bigger, bolder collective imagination. And we're making the case that the end of American innocence about our history doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be a new beginning. And that, I believe, is really something that all of our authors exemplify, and something that we're so excited to be able to share with you all. Chris? You're muted.
Thank you for all those resources, and thank you also, Janai. And I just wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists here tonight, all of the authors who took the time to share this information with us, and for everyone who took the time to join us. We ran a little long, so I'm gonna leave it at that, but thank you all so much. And I hope you're able to take advantage of some of these resources, and of course, read some of these books. And thank you again.
Thank you.